challenge to me to this idea of polycomputing, that we really need to rethink what computation would mean in that case.
You had in your participatory knowledge talk at the McGilchrist conference, you'd referenced some conceptual, resonance with Mike's talk of basically polycomputation. There's a cool way of looking at this polycomputational stuff as a kind of perspectivalism and also a kind of comparative methods, where you've basically got all of these agents that are working together like cells organized into a multicellular organism, and they are all taking slightly different perspectives on, whatever the desideratum might be. They're all coarse-graining it in slightly different ways, i.e. they're all keying into slightly different properties or aspects of whatever it is focus upon. And the sum of all of these different images, it might be something like presentational immediacy in Whitehead's terms, a symbolic function of mapping these things, symbolic in Whitehead's terms, of mapping all of these different perspectives onto each other, and then what the organism as a whole perceives is this presentational immediacy that's somehow derived from all of these different perspectives. It can be synthesized and it can also be pulled apart.
In Whitehead's terms, to what extent are the eternal objects definite prior to ingression, prior to their exemplification in some actual occasion? Well, they must have some definite character, even in advance of particular actualizations, because this is where his picture of the primordial nature comes in. They're already being envisaged in their definiteness by the divine. He has this universe of multiple perspectives, each coarse-graining its own Umwelt in a sense. There's relationality there, and there's a sense in which all of these perspectives are they share a nexus, Whitehead would say. In Whitehead's cosmology, you have these perspectives, they're in nexus with one another. What keeps them from being in conflict, in contradiction with one another, is the extensive continuum. Whitehead would say, though, that actually the extensive continuum would be a set of rules of relation more general than our cosmic epoch and its special spatio-temporal arrangement, that the 3 dimensions of space and 4th dimension of time that relativity describes isn't necessarily the only way nature could order itself. The extensive continuum for Whitehead provides the common nexus of relationships for those multiple perspectives to not be in conflict with each other. And one of the roles of eternal objects is that it provides a shared reality for all of these perspectives to participate in. And each perspective has a lot of freedom to self-create. There's also some degree to which it must conform to the spatio-temporal positions of all of the other perspectives that it is sharing this nexus of relations with.
He's borrowing a lot from Jung, and Jung is thinking about this in terms of determinate forms and ideas erupting from the pluripotent potential of the unconscious. We could talk about whether things are there in determinate form, just unconscious, and then they emerge kind of fully formed. The extensive continuum idea, we can think of that in terms of these pre-existent maybe tensions, gradients in a landscape of Potentia. Is that landscape in flux itself? So are those tensions, are those gradients transitory until such point as a particular actualization occurs and actually starts to lock in a certain structure to that landscape? Or is it always conforming? And again, if it's topological, it can be both conforming and also metastable, right? It's metastable, but within certain deformations are consistent with it being essentially the same shape.
Is the extensive continuum changed? Is the topology shifted in some sense as a result of what's actualized? The realm of eternal objects is infinite. Can that sort of a realm change? No, right? It doesn't change, except in relationship to what actualizes.
If we were thinking about it in terms of a probability distribution associated with the exploration of it by a lineage of actualization, which could be the lineage that is the universe, let's say, that distribution changes a great deal. It's what's accessible. You brought up Kaufman, but the notion of adjacency, right? We can think of, everything that's possible given no particular contingent history of actualization. All actualizations are then possible in a certain sense. So that maximal configuration space, whether it's continuous or discrete, maximal topology or turbos if you want, where we're going to end up on that landscape, that is changing a great deal based on a contingent history of which Potentia, which possibilities actually get actualized. And it's quite intuitive, especially if one's thinking in terms of these sort of mathematical and now computational models of state spaces and the like, to be thinking about this huge state space that pre-existed and this lineage that's exploring it. And are we talking about a really constructive process in which it's not only the actual which is being constructed, but the potential is being, the possibility, landscape of possibility or potential is also being constructed?
Maybe we can distinguish between the possible and the potential here. The universe has to be possible before it can be actual. Possibility would be something more like the realm of eternal objects. The potential, though, would always be relative to what's been actualized. It's what's relevant to the perspective that has been actualized in its unique spatio-temporal situation. Part of what I found so interesting about polycomputing, as Levin lays it out, is he suggests it as an observer-dependent, pragmatic approach. But there's a double meaning to observer dependence here. If you're going to generalize computation, then so that it applies to living organisms, then I think you're adding the act of observation itself to the materials that you're studying. You're saying these materials are observing me too. I'm not just observing them. Then these are not just computational materials, these are observing materials.
The idea that each discrete entity or a monad in Leibniz's sense, though, has this particular view on, like, perspective. It's a perspectivalism, right? It has a particular perspective on the entire cosmos.
Evolution is always co-evolution of organisms and environments. That does put limits on what we can expect, and it also raises questions about the risks of designing learning systems or designing agents that we just can't predict well enough to know how they're going to affect the environment. We're so used to thinking of intelligence in a very individualized sense, whereas what I think Mike's work is pointing to is how collective intelligence is. In the living world, all function and purpose is coactively realized, which is to say there's a whole swarm of agents which you could isolate and say they each have their own interests, but they're, one of the implications of polycomputing is that agency is always co-agency. It's always discovered with those that you're adjacent to, that you come through these adaptive evolutionary processes of you enter into symbiosis with those fellow agents and realize purposes beyond what any individual can even fathom.
And it's very messy in the sense that a lot of those relationships, those symbiotic relationships, can start out with a particular kind of valence, like they can be antagonistic, and then they flip at a certain point into a mutualism. And that's not just a hand-wavy thing. Again, we could work through some molecular examples of that kind of thing. And that's part of what I am writing about with Mike at the moment. It's that happens all the time. So yes, it's very messy in that sense.
I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier with causation and causal efficacy, because it struck me that for a default materialistic imagination, we immediately go to, when we think of causation, like one particle colliding with another particle. And we think of causation in terms of motion, the motion of bodies and the exchange of forces between bodies. And I think causation, as Whitehead is trying to reimagine it, is more so, it's actually closer to memory than it is to motion or the exchange of forces between bodies, or even emotion, rather than just thinking of it as the exchange of a force from one moving body to another. Causation, but Whitehead is saying that causation and causal efficacy it's about the propagation of the past and into the present. I've heard Mike ask questions, and he gets asked this question all the time, like, where's this pattern stored in this bioelectric field that emerges in the course of the developmental history of an organism? Where's the pattern stored? And he's not sure. But this idea of a Platonic morphospace comes up, and he's exploring that as a hypothesis, which is cool. But I think when we understand Whitehead's view of causality, It's like that becomes the wrong question to ask. Where is it stored? It's there in the past because the past is constantly accumulating in the present. It's still present here with us. It's not somewhere else. The idea of memories having to be stored, it's not that I'm saying they're stored in the past. The past isn't somewhere else besides what's already here. Bergson is so good on this question too. The nature of memory being it's implicit and non-locally extended throughout the whole of the universe, moment by moment. This can be done in a computational way. The iterations are always being added to or accumulated. The computation is open-ended in a sense, and there's not a closed algorithmic loop. Accumulation of novelty that then does get stored in some sense, but it's stored in the field of potentiality that remains relevant to what occurs in the present.
But, maybe they didn't have to be the way that they are. I mean, they had to be the way they are for us to be here, and that's kind of a trivial observation in a certain sense, right? We wouldn't be if the universe wasn't the way that it is. If we're starting from a model of a kind of pluripotent creativity as the fundamental thing, but which also persists, then it could have taken many different kinds of arrangements. It took a certain arrangement, and this becomes this relational arrangement. It's stabilized by the formation of certain kinds of relationships. That becomes the constraint function which canalizes everything else. And so that, in a sense, is the birth of some of these more determinate forms or eternal objects. You get this landscape all of a sudden which forms because, and so that means peaks, troughs, etc., canals, ways things are going to be constrained, things that things are going to have to come into conformity with. There could be practically or functionally infinite number of ways of being in conformity with a set of fundamental constraints. It's like if a system is persisting over time as that system, if it's identifiable as the same system through a sequence of events, it will necessarily be obeying this certain, be modelable, obeying this certain set of constraints. It's basically what it is to be a thing over time. That's what the free energy principle attempts to provide for us. But there are any number of ways of being that kind of thing.
Once you've accepted a evolutionary cosmology, it seems to me that the mystery of fine-tuning kind of goes away. It becomes something more like fine-tuning of fundamental constants becomes something more like the emergent attunement of co-creative constraints. It appears finely tuned, these fundamental constants from our point of view, because we're still projecting stasis onto something that's an evolutionary process. It doesn't just happen to be that way. It's that way because there was a co-evolution of everything in the universe. All of the fields and the particles, or the relative standing waves that emerge out of these fields over the course of history are co-evolved, just like organisms and environments evolve with each other. It should be no surprise that there would be this attunement.
We are attuned to it. Obviously, we were made. It's a constraint on us, but we're made possible by that constraint. Of course, so it's beautiful to us as well. We are made of that.
And that's part of what constitutes life, this capacity for mental originality, he would say. I'm glad you brought in Abduction, because Peirce's account of that and the continuity it implies between our minds and nature, I think, is an example of what I was getting at earlier around this non-statistical basis for prediction, or a non-statistical basis for making judgments of probability. There is that continuity there. You don't need to calculate or hypothesize based on using Bayesian reasoning or something. It's a different kind of intuitive leap that implies this non-local connection, in a sense, between our local perspective and this ground of possibility that would be something like Whitehead's extensive continuum. An observer capable of abduction is not limited by the unprestatability of future functions, because there's this intuitive link between the mental originality and that plenum of possibility by which all things are extensively connected to one another according to certain rules. And we can't state what those rules are. They're too general in a way. They're just too abstract for us to even wrap a concept around. But nonetheless, they're part of what structures our mind and part of what structures the world. Judgments through abduction are an example of that. It's a great term for what Whitehead calls non-statistical judgments of probability. The phrase relevant novelty comes to mind to me here. In every event which is occurring, in those cases where there's an observer, there's a sense of relevant novelty, and there's an initial aim there that's not determining what's going to happen, but there's, among those infinite possibilities or potentials that could be actualized, there's a constraint in place that makes some of them more relevant than others. That function, or it's kind of a meta function that all functions presuppose, is that there would be this initial aim there that grants relevant novelty. It's not determining, but it's constraining what might happen next in a way that makes it not just random.
It may have a random or arbitrary element to it, but like a stochastic element to it. But the process as a whole of that new quality is no, it's not random. It's constrained. Random or arbitrary or whatever, that is the pure creative thing. It's arbitrarily jiggling or just dynamically changing.
That would always produce irrelevance, or almost always produce irrelevancies.
Produces a whole lot of irrelevance. Of course, what's salient or relevant to some may be irrelevant to others. We underestimate the role of caprice as well in all of this. You've got the pre-actualized, the pre-existent actualized that's stable at some temporal scale. Then you've got this rapid change thing that's happening, this stochastic element that's shaking things up and making possible new relations amongst pre-stabilized things. There's an arbitrary or a random shaking, jiggling, moving, but that's going to be constrained by what is pre-existent. And then there's this element of caprice, which is what we invoke when something fortuitous happens within that landscape of possibility. At the molecular level, you've got all sorts of things bumping into each other all the time and sticking to each other for a moment and unsticking and whatever. And most of that doesn't necessarily lead to anything. That's, maybe important because some of the constraint functions are ensuring that those sorts of random effects don't get out of hand. Every now and then you do get some kind of emergent novelty. And I think it's just maybe underappreciated even in sort of evolutionary biology and evolutionary thinking circles, how much at some very, very pointy end we are reliant on this notion of caprice, like things have to come together at the right time in the right place, or kairos, for there to be a relevant novelty introduced into the world that has an opportunity of being stabilized. It could potentially be stabilized at different, timescales, right? Like, is it just stabilized developmentally in the lifetime of that individual, but then when that individual dies, it's gone? Or is there a mechanism at hand for, epigenetically stabilizing it, or stabilizing it through some kind of cultural transmission or whatever? Will it eventually be stabilized in the lineage? Well, a lot of these things have to come together in a certain way for lasting novelty to come into the world. There's a law of large numbers thing that has to just be brought into the discussion as well, because so much is happening all the time. Some small percentage of that can lead to the ingression, I suppose, the concretization, congrescence of relevant novelty.
It would still need to be selectively amplified. And we're circling over a lot of ground where we've covered before, but I feel like we're getting clearer on the structure of the ideas and where to intervene. That Jung did describe archetypes as evolving, and so they start to sound more like essences. It's an easy misreading to make, if you don't think through with Jung the way in which archetypes can be more like, they're collective habits in a sense, and they're subject to collective evolution.